Good morrow, one and all. I'm Mr. King, and today I've come outside to talk to you about the top 5 victims that you might have to study for your GCSEs. In this list, I'll be looking at characters in plays and novels that you might have to study in preparation for your exams, but I won't be looking at victims in the poetry anthology, because that's a separate list altogether. Obviously, there are going to be some spoilers ahead, so you have been warned. Before I begin, if you'd like more videos like this one, or if you'd like more help for your GCSEs, then please hit that subscribe and that like button below. Let's dive straight in with number 5, Juliet, from Romeo and Juliet. Now my students can tell you that Juliet is not my favourite character in all of literature, but she is worthy of some sympathy. When she falls in love with Romeo, she can't be with him because her family, the Capulets, have an ancient grudge against Romeo's family, the Montagues. The family are at odds with each other. Her cousin Tybalt is even killed in the play because of the altercations between the two families. Juliet secretly marries Romeo, but they can't be together when Romeo is exiled from Verona. During this time, her father says that Juliet has to marry a bachelor called Paris. Now, Juliet's father doesn't know that Juliet is secretly married, so when Juliet refuses, her father goes mad. He threatens to throw her out on the street, he threatens to disown her, he even threatens to hit her.
My fingers itch.
Juliet can see no other way out other than faking her own death. And when she wakes up in the crypts, thinking she'll be able to sneak off and go and be with Romeo, she finds her husband lying dead next to him. This is a tragic outcome of a tragic play, and she is certainly worthy of lots of sympathy. That brings us to number 4, Tiny Tim, from A Christmas Carol. Who doesn't love Tiny Tim? He's kind, he's charming, and he's spouting God bless us everyone all the time. He's also born into poverty, living a really hard life, and one of the first things we learn about him is that he's disabled and dying of a curable disease. Now, we're never told exactly what's going on with Tiny Tim, but because of the use of time travel in this novel, we learn that Tiny Tim is able to be saved by the intervention of Scrooge. So that suggests that Tiny Tim was suffering from curable illnesses such as malnutrition. Now, in one timeline in the story, Tiny Tim dies from his curable diseases, and it's a moment which makes me well up every time I read it. But in a second version of the story, he does survive and lives, as far as we can tell, happily ever after, with Scrooge taking better care of the Cratchit family. So if he survives and Juliet dies, why is Tiny Tim number 4 on my list when Juliet is number 5? While I have sympathy for Juliet, she did choose to marry Romeo knowing full well that the Montagues and the Capulets were enemies of one another, whereas Tiny Tim is simply a victim of poverty and illness, neither of which was in his control, which is why Tiny Tim is number 4 on my list. That brings us to number 3, Jane Eyre from... Jane Eyre. Jane Eyre is a fascinating novel if you haven't read it by Charlotte Bronte, but Bronte's novel is much darker than anything Jane Austen's written, for example. Jane Eyre is both a heroine and a victim at the same time. Where do we start with Jane Eyre? As a child, she's bullied by her Aunt Mrs. Reed and her cousins. She's even locked up in a room which is so traumatising for her that she thinks she starts to see ghosts. She's then sent to a school which is so poorly run that half the students there, including her best friend, die of typhus. And then, just when she thinks her luck is changing and she goes to work for Mr. Rochester, who she falls in love with, and he proposes, on her wedding day, a lawyer turns up and says, "You can't get married because Mr. Rochester is already married." So Jane Eyre ends up running away after finding out that the love of her life was already married to someone who was mad and who he was lying about and hiding in his attic. Later on in the novel, after Jane Eyre endures a period of homelessness, she is able to be with Mr. Rochester, but her happy ending only comes about because Mr. Rochester's mad wife burns down the house, blinds Mr. Rochester in the process, and Jane Eyre ends the novel albeit happy with her half-blind husband. Jane Eyre's list of tragedies is so long that she's definitely worthy of number 3 on this list. Next, at number 2, it's Eva Smith from An Inspector Calls. Why is Eva Smith number 2 at this list? She is the epitome of a victim. She suffers at the hands of almost everyone in the Burling family, including future son-in-law Gerald. So, where do we start with Eva Smith? First, she's sacked from Mr. Burling's factory because she demands a meagre pay rise. Then, she's sacked from her second job because Sheila Burling makes an unfair complaint about her. Then, she's briefly shown some care by Gerald, but eventually he stops looking after her and leaves her to her own devices to fend for herself. Then, after a drunken night, Eric Burling forces his way into her apartment. Eventually, she becomes pregnant with his child, but he's not able to look after her. He steals money to give to her, but she refuses to accept stolen money, so goes to Mrs. Burling's charity asking for help, and Mrs. Burling refuses to give her the smallest bit of assistance. After all of these disappointments, and after struggling for so long, eventually Eva Smith takes her own life. Eva Smith's death is a message to all of us about how important it is that society takes care of one another, and her tragic life and her tragic death is why she is number 2 on my list. Before I reveal my number 1 pick, here are a few honourable mentions. King Duncan from Macbeth, Caliban from The Tempest, Sir Danvers Carew from Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. So, who managed to beat Eva Smith to number 1 on this list? It's Boxer from Animal Farm. Boxer might seem like a strange choice for number 1 on this list, but I've been teaching Animal Farm for years and I cannot make it to the end of chapter 9 without tearing up in some way. Boxer was a horse who lived on Animal Farm at the time when all of the animals rebelled against Farmer Jones and kicked him and all other humans off the farm. Eventually, it's the pigs who take over the running of the farm, but they run the farm like some kind of totalitarian dictatorship. All of the other animals, including Boxer, are forced to work like slaves, but no one works harder than Boxer. He trusts that the leader, Napoleon, is always right and never questions his authority. He works so hard, dragging rocks up hills so they can build a windmill together, but eventually his strength gives out. He hopes he'll be able to retire in peace with his friend Benjamin. He just needs a vet to come and give him some medical care, and the pigs do promise to get him a vet, but in reality they send him to the knackers to be slaughtered. The cart comes to collect Boxer, and Boxer gets on it, and as the door is closed, some of the other animals realise that the cart says that it belongs to the knackers, and they shout to Boxer, "Get out, get out!" and Boxer tries to kick his way out of the cart, but he can't, and the cart is taken away, and Boxer knows he's going to his own death. Boxer's death is even more tragic when we later learn that the pigs used the money from selling Boxer to the knackers to buy alcohol so they can have a drunken party. I found it really hard to choose between Boxer and Eva for this number 1 choice. But one reason why Boxer ultimately won is, unlike Eva, Boxer is given dialogue in this story, so we see how his idealism and his naivety is betrayed in such a cruel and calculating way, whereas Eva, who I feel immense sympathy for, we only ever hear about second or third hand. And for me, that closeness to Boxer, given that we have his dialogue, makes his death that little bit more tragic. But what do you think? Do you agree with my list? Let me know in the comments below. So that's been my top 5 victims that you might have to study for your GCSEs. If you'd like more videos like this, please hit those like and subscribe buttons. And until next time, cheerio. He falls in love, he proposes, they're about to get married, when on her... Married? Ugh, what am I about? Married? Jane Eyre is a fascinating character, although it's much darker than similar novels like Austen novels, for example. Examples? Sound like a meerkat from the Compared a Meerkat movie. Movie? Oh. What am I on about?